Unacceptable, unsustainable and immature political system. Northern Ireland has been stuck in limbo. That's the damning verdict on the absence of devolution here in a new report as we approach 1,000 days without a working government. The investigation was carried out by the Institute for Government, and one of the key people behind it, Jess Sargeant, joins me now from London. Jess, welcome to you. The report certainly doesn't make for comfortable reading. What you're effectively saying, if I've read it correctly, is if we're looking for a good example of how not to do devolved government, Northern Ireland is it. Is that fair?
I think certainly one of the things we really highlight in the report is just how difficult the arrangements to make government work are in Northern Ireland. And there's obviously good reason that those institutions are formulated the way that they are. They make devolved government possible, but they also make it difficult. And so that requires a lot of political leaders. So one of the things that we do in the report is not just look at the consequences of the absence of government and what's happened during this period, but we look forward to think that how can good government be supported in future once the future executive is restored.
We'll come on to the absence of devolution in a moment and the very particular challenges thrown up by that. But you do conclude that even when we had it, it was far from perfect.
Absolutely, and I think you can say that of any government. We've identified a few particular challenges that are faced by the Northern Ireland executive. Some of these are also common in Westminster and elsewhere. So, for example, the ability of ministers to make long-term decisions, I think, is one of the difficulties we identified, but that's obviously also an issue in the UK as well. But then there are also obviously very specific issues faced by the particular Northern Ireland institutions. So, for example, that because departments are run by different parties, quite often that makes cross-party working and cross-departmental working quite difficult. And so, like some of these problems are unique to Northern Ireland. Some of them are also common across other democracies, and our report looks at how you can support and try and deal with those issues.
We'll talk about some of the detail in just a moment or two, but to be clear, in drawing up the report, as I said in the introduction, it's about 70 pages. It's a substantial piece of work. You looked at the relevant literature, of course, but you also spoke on and off the record, am I right, to a lot of figures who are involved in the governance of Northern Ireland, not least very senior civil servants.
Yeah, absolutely. We wanted to get a wide perspective from Northern Ireland. Based in London at the Institute for Government, we're very aware that we're not experts in these matters, and because of the lack of government, because of the lack of ministers, quite often it's very difficult to find out what's going on in government in Northern Ireland without talking to the people that are really responsible for doing it. And so we were very keen to get a cross-section of society of the people that are actually, running Northern Ireland when in the absence of ministers.
So to what extent, Jess, do you think we've suffered from what we might call a lack of political maturity here? I mean, you quote one interviewee who says the DUP and Sinn Féin wanted to tax like the Conservatives but spend like Labour. You also reflect on the failings of the Stormont committee system. Have we been let down by the quality of our political representatives?
I mean, one thing to remember is that devolution in Northern Ireland, although it dates back to 1921, and the most recent kind of institutions are only 20 years old, and so there are likely to be kind of teething problems and issues that arise in those issues. And so, yes, it's really important to look at how they can be supported to make better decisions.
We are 33 months, almost 1,000 days without a working government at Stormont. What is your assessment of the particular challenges thrown up by that?
Yeah, so our report identifies 6 key challenges. I'll discuss just a few of them. There's the most obvious problems of lack of decision-making, so issues on which there is political disagreement, but quite often because legislation is required and the Northern Ireland Assembly is unwilling and the UK Parliament, the Northern Ireland Assembly unable and the UK Parliament unwilling to legislate, there's no progress. So we're thinking about things like the inquiry into historical institutional abuse and compensation for victims. But another consequence that was highlighted very clearly to us by members of the Northern Ireland Civil Service is the kind of inability to make long-term policy changes. So thinking particularly here about transformation in public services, the kind of vital reforms that are needed to make these services sustainable long-term. A lot of those aren't happening, which means that there's going to be long-term implications for this period of lack of government. Another issue is obviously the lack of ministerial representation in the Brexit process. There's no one to kind of represent Northern Ireland as a whole, and as a consequence of the Conservative Party's confidence to supply agreement with the DUP, there's also kind of the amplification of one particular perspective in Northern Ireland, which has been a quite key consequence of this period of lack of government.
And you conclude there is a general lack of understanding of Northern Ireland in Westminster, a culture of slow decision-making, putting off difficult decisions. And then you quote the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, David Stirling, who's talked about the current stagnation and decay of public services. That's pretty strong language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is real concern about the kind of long-term implications of this, particularly for public services in areas like health and education. Health perhaps has a slightly more clearer mandate for transformation because there was some agreement on how that would be done just prior to the collapse of the executive. But there are still lots of decisions like reconfiguration of services that can't be made. Meanwhile, emergency waiting times, the numbers of people waiting more than 12 hours for emergency care in Northern Ireland emergency departments has spiked considerably since the executive collapsed.
OK, Jess, very good to get your thoughts on it. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme today. Jess Sargeant from the Institute for Government.